Anger and grief as protests turned to memorial services in Minneapolis after the death of George Floyd. A spike in COVID cases has Ontario extend its state of emergency for another 4 weeks. Humber College announces its plans for the fall term. Humber News starts now. Hello, I'm Rachael Dyal, coming to you with our first ever virtual newsroom for Humber's North Campus. It's Thursday, June the 4th. Here's what's making news. George Floyd's death in Minnesota has sparked worldwide protests against racism and police brutality. The world mourns for George Floyd as his casket arrives for his memorial service today at North Central University in Minneapolis. Earlier today, 3 officers who were standing by as George Floyd choked to death are now all charged and made their first court appearances. If convicted, they could face up to 40 years in prison.
Today, arrest warrants were issued for former Minneapolis police officers J.A. King, Thomas Lane, and Tu Tao. Finally, I'd like to announce that today, Hennepin County Attorney Michael Freeman and I filed a complaint that charges police officer King, Lane, and Tao with aiding and abetting murder in the second degree, a felony offense.
This sentencing follows the elevation in charges against former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin from third-degree to second-degree murder. In the wake of the new charges, peaceful protesting continues, with some protesters seen grilling and distributing food in front of a Cup Foods where Floyd died. The area has been a hub for demonstrators, where many have gathered to build a makeshift memorial. A series of nationwide memorial services for George Floyd began in Minneapolis today. The anti-racism protests that started in the U.S. have spread to many cities around the world, with thousands protesting, defying coronavirus bans. In New Zealand's capital, Wellington, hundreds of protesters chanted "Black Lives Matter" as they marched towards the American embassy. The U.S. Embassy in Greece also witnessed demonstration by protesters in the wake of George Floyd's death. Kenya witnessed protesters shouting slogans of "Black Lives Matter" and "No More Killings," condemning police violence in both the U.S. and Kenya. London had its second rally on Wednesday when thousands gathered in Hyde Park, filled with rage against racial injustice around the world. Frankfurt protesters included children gathered with placards wearing face masks reading "I can't breathe." In South Africa, peaceful protesters carried signs and laid flowers outside the parliament in Cape Town. Here at home, thousands of Canadians protested in cities like Toronto and Montreal, chanting slogans like "No justice, no peace." Former U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis has accused President Donald Trump of purposely dividing American citizens through his leadership during the nationwide protests. This statement breaks the general's long-standing public silence on Trump, his first public comments since his resignation in December 2018. Mattis openly called out Trump as, quote, "the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people. He does not even pretend to try." He also heavily criticized Trump's recent threats of involving the military against the protests and called on the government to rethink its response to the protests, saying, quote, "We must reject and hold accountable those in office who would make a mockery of our Constitution." Prime Minister Trudeau's daily briefings to the country continue, but it was his extra-long pause and address earlier this week that captured headlines around the world. There's a question from a CBC reporter that left the Prime Minister at a loss for words.
You've been reluctant to comment on the words and actions of the U.S. president, but we do have Donald Trump now calling for military action against protesters. We saw protesters tear gas yesterday to make way for a presidential photo op. I'd like to ask you what you think about that, and if you don't want to comment, what message do you think you're sending?
The long pause lasted more than 20 seconds, and when the Prime Minister finally responded, he avoided mentioning Trump or criticizing the US, instead focusing on racial discrimination here in Canada.
Black Canadians and racialized Canadians face discrimination as a lived reality every single day. There is systemic discrimination in Canada, which means our systems treat Canadians of color, Canadians who are racialized, differently than they do others. It is something that many of us don't see, but it is something that is a lived reality for racialized Canadians.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh criticized Trudeau for his failure to speak up about Trump's threats, and Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet said that Trudeau, quote, needs a spine. In the wake of the anti-Black racism protests worldwide, Humber College president Chris Whitaker released a statement earlier this week. "We are stronger together," was Whitaker's message. He said Humber College takes issues of racism, including anti-Black racism, very seriously and condemns such acts. "The diversity of the Humber community is one of our greatest strengths," he said. Also at Humber this week, the college announced its plans for the upcoming fall semester, joining other post-secondary institutions and adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic. The statement says that 60% of Humber's programs will be delivered online, while the remaining programs will have a mix of in-person and online components. Other main details of the plan include services continuing to be available, as well as tuition rates staying the same across all programs. But some students are already asking questions about how the changes will affect their finances. Alison Gallagher has the story.
Welcome to Humber.
Now under COVID-19, Humber won't be welcoming students as normal this fall, with many programs moving online. Already, many students are questioning having to pay the same tuition rates without having access to Humber's facilities. For students in the 3D animation program, the movement to online courses creates an even greater financial burden, one of which is the requirement to purchase new laptops to make up for the labs they would usually have access to.
So we are again having to spend again an additional cost of almost $2,000 apart from the expenditure that we're already having.
For students that depend on Humber facilities and equipment, some believe the decision to keep current tuition rates will be especially hard for international students.
We're not eligible to any of those emergency funds the government is making available. So I don't know how international students are going to make do.
Fernanda Lacerda and Triniana Kaipuram even started an online petition urging Humber to lower its tuition for programs that are moving online. It currently has over 2,300 signatures and counting. Humber's official statement explains that the fees are staying the same to cover the cost of academic program delivery and are not specific to the mode of delivery. But Kaipuram believes the way in which courses are delivered should be considered when assessing fees.
The delivery does affect us because the quality that we receive in person is completely different from what we receive online.
While tuition will remain the same, the announcement said that certain ancillary fees for campus services will be adjusted based on Humber's ability to provide them. More information on those costs and other details will be released in the coming weeks. Alison Gallagher, Humber News.
Ontario reported 356 new COVID-19 cases today. That's 18 up from yesterday. Earlier this week, the Ontario government extended the province's state of emergency through to June 30th. Premier Doug Ford had hinted that the province would begin to cautiously open up the economy, moving to stage 2 of the province's 3-stage plan, but those plans are yet to have a confirmed date. Ford said the government is looking at a regional approach, starting with rural areas. For small-town Ontario, businesses and restaurants have been hit by the closures, and the Premier has suggested balcony restaurants outside the city may be the first to reopen to customers. While it was previously said that the reopening in small-town Ontario could begin by next week, no such confirmation was given at today's press conference. Face masks and diligent hand washing may be protecting many Canadians from COVID-19, but a shortage in health resources is leaving refugees around the world especially vulnerable to the virus. Displaced people face overcrowding at camps, poor sanitation options, and a lack of disease testing. The UNHCR says this has led to a ticking bomb situation in Yemen where 3.6 million people are internally displaced.
Hygiene items like soaps are not necessarily the priority. When you have little money, you will still start feeding your children before buying a soap.
The agency says migrants are also stigmatized as vectors of the coronavirus and must deal with discrimination.
People have lost their daily job. Mainly they work in the informal sector. Some have received threats. We have seen neighborhoods being cordoned by the authorities and targeting really of IDPs and refugees.
A Reuters tally has confirmed 72 cases of COVID-19 and 13 deaths resulting from the virus in Yemen. But health experts say that these numbers are likely much higher due to a lack of testing. The Arabian country is a transit point for refugees and asylum seekers from countries like Somalia and Syria. Hundreds of thousands of Yemen residents have also lived in displaced people camps due to an ongoing conflict and political unrest. With migrants at a high risk of contracting COVID-19, accurate information has emerged as an important line of defense for refugee communities in Uganda. Humber journalism was on the ground in the East African country in January, where reporters learned about the crucial role news plays in humanitarian aid. Lucy Lau was part of the team who traveled to Uganda. She joins me now.
Hi Rachel, that's right. Earlier this year, Humber journalism took part in a multimedia project in Uganda. And while we were covering a different topic, we had the chance to talk to journalists about the work they're doing to increase access to information in refugee communities. This work is especially crucial now, given the number of refugees in Uganda and the risks they face during the pandemic.
With its lush landscapes, rich biodiversity, and warm and welcoming way of life, Uganda is known as the Pearl of Africa. But behind that beauty lies a painful past, one marked by colonialism, harsh dictatorships, and brutal insurgencies. This history has led to humanitarian practices in the East African nation, including an open-door refugee policy that's embraced thousands of displaced people since 2006. They come from neighboring countries like South Sudan, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and represent a population of 1.3 million people, making Uganda the world's third largest refugee hosting nation.
Impevi Refugee Settlement opened in 2017 and is one of Uganda's newest, but it's nearing capacity in only 3 years and now houses more than 120,000 newcomers.
With so many people living in settlements like these, the broadcast of clear, accurate information has become vital to survival.
A very good morning. It is on 9 a.m. and from wherever you're tuned in, it is time for the news. I'm Jacqueline Kampindo. Let's look at the details.
Information is important because it can save lives, especially if it's delivered in the right forum and in a timely way.
This distribution of news is even more important amid the coronavirus outbreak, when disinformation runs rampant through communities. Media outlets like Spice FM in the city of Hoima are working to combat that.
There are many witch doctors and pastors that are claiming they can cure COVID-19, and they do not encourage people to practice any of the restrictions that are put in place by the government. So this is where we come in to help these communities as well as the health officials.
Church of Uganda
It partners with Internews Uganda to deliver daily coronavirus updates in local languages, so residents at the nearby Changwali refugee settlement have the facts they need.
Then the other thing, we are using community correspondents from Internews to help us with the rumor tracking that is happening in the refugee settlement and the other areas where they are in the host community within Changwali and the neighboring sub-counties.
It's all part of the radio station's larger mandate to bridge the information gap and ensure the well-being of refugees. For Humber News, I'm Lucy Lau.
The world saw its first commercial spaceflight on Saturday, when NASA and SpaceX teamed up to create history. Anushka Yadav has that story.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff.
And in that moment, 2 NASA astronauts made history, becoming the first to fly in the reusable rocket Falcon 9.
What SpaceX has done is they've been able to, take reusability to another level, with their technology that is in some ways more complex and simpler than what had been flown previously. So it's definitely a game changer.
What SpaceX has done, they were doing stuff in months that would have taken NASA even years per se. What do you think? How did a private company do that to an extent that it didn't affect the quality of the engineering?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest things is they're very focused and methodical with their work. So their CEO Elon Musk is very driven, obviously, and that translates into his company. But they have a plan, and they had a roadmap, and they stuck to it.
9 years after the flight of Space Shuttle, SpaceX became the first private company to send US astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken into orbit from the American soil in an American spacecraft. US President Donald Trump came to witness the launch even as his country burned in anger.
Real talent, real genius. Nobody does it like us. So it's great to have this whole program back, and it's just the beginning. It's just the beginning. We have many more things to come.
Bob and Doug are expected to spend 4 months at the International Space Station before their return. This is Anushka Yadav reporting for Humber News.
Humber Music and Media Production students have collaborated for a creative tribute to honor Canada's frontline workers. We share that with you here now. I'm Rachael Dyal for Humber News. We'll see you again next time.